It's another Hot Takes Day. Let's take a look at the things everyone in Marvel Snap is angry about. Not sure if it's a hot take, but 2024 so far feels like the year of the super pushed 3/5s Nocturne, Copycat, New Loki, Red Guardian, and I'm curious if we see a similar thing happen next year in one of the other mana slots. I think this is an interesting thing to bring up because the 3/5 stuff has had some real knock on effects that I think are interesting to talk about. For example, Iron Lad as a 4/6 used to be a good stat baseline card that had upside attached to it. But now, when you could play a Copycat or a Nocturne instead at 3/5, I think maybe cards like Iron Lad see less and less play as a result of that. There's always going to be some stat line where having a good effect on it is going to be a little bit better because of the way Marvel Snap is balanced and because of something that I've talked about before, the vanilla curve. I don't know how many people think about this very much, but the vanilla curve being 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 6, 5, 9, 6, 12 does not give a lot of room for cards to really improve at the early port of that curve. Like, there's not a lot of room for how much bigger than 4 a 3-drop can reasonably be and still have an upside. Whereas at the higher end of that curve, there is a lot of room to mess around. You could probably print things like, 614 Giganto, it's not even good. 616 Destroyer, it's not even good. Like, there are things you can print at that range. Blob, for example, is sort of a minimum 613, often actually bigger with the cost of just playing an Arishem in your deck. There's more you can do at the higher end of the curve. One of the things that this question really brings to mind for me is what happens if they change that curve? Like, let's say it's 1 3 and then 2 5 and then 3 6 or 7, right? And then you start like scaling the game up entirely. I think that's probably something you can't do. But in a world where you could do that, I think that would be something that would be worth looking into because fundamentally what Marvel Snap's early game cards suffer from is the lack of a real clear gradation between them. A lot of 1 and 2 and 3 drops would be a lot easier to balance if you could put half a power on them. But you kind of can't because that's not really a thing. And I think maybe spreading out the curve, if they were to have done that originally, would have been a way to avoid this. But when you talk about why this is an issue, why these push 3/5s keep happening, they keep happening because that's what it takes to get them to be good. No one would be playing Copycat at 3/4. They just wouldn't be. And I think that is sort of the real issue that is being exposed here, is that the vanilla curve has some fundamental imbalances in that. And if you want to make a card playable in the metagame, you have to sort of ignore the vanilla curve, which further reveals the issues with the vanilla curve. This one's good because we actually did a little bit of a quote-unquote investigative reporting on this one. They should reduce the amount of time you have to submit your turn, especially on turns 1 and 2. No one should be taking the whole amount of time to play one card. I responded, I'm pretty sure they actually already did this a couple months ago. Turns 1 and 2, I think, are shorter than the other turns in the game. And Glenn Jones actually got back to me. Confirmed. We took 30 seconds off in total a few months ago, if memory serves, most of it from 1 and 2. See, I'm interested in this because I wonder how much more they could have taken off before people started noticing. Because I don't think anyone in the entire world, like, I think I would probably say 90% of players did not notice that they made this change. And that to me means there's more room on there that they can take off, right? If people aren't even noticing that those turns are slower because they're just never running into anyone who ropes them, maybe we could take even more time off of turn 1 and 2, especially turn 1. I really do wonder about that. Like, turn 1 should be like a very short amount of time. I also think that maybe from a game design perspective, you don't necessarily want your turn 1 to be much shorter than every other turn in the game. It would just feel weird, maybe. I haven't really thought that one out. I'm not really a game designer. I wouldn't know, but there might be a good reason why they haven't done that. That said, I do think generally they should experiment with shaving even more time off of turn 1, off of turn 2, if they find themselves able to do that. And I would expect that since people didn't even seem to notice they did it in the first place, they're not running into situations where that timer ever actually happens, so you could probably take more time off. Galactus needs a buff. All right, so this one is on basically every hot takes post. Someone has this take. And one of the sort of running gags of the show has been, this is a really common take that everyone always likes to bring up because they weren't really playing when Galactus was there, or they don't really understand what it is about Galactus that's so objectionable. But it's been a while, and so I figured I would talk about what exactly is so objectionable about Galactus. Galactus's ability effectively turns Marvel Snap into a binary thing, where like there is an amount of Galactus that would be okay to have in the metagame if it was like, I don't know, 4 or 5%. I think it would be acceptable to have. But because he is so hard to move up or down, it kind of runs into a scenario where any sort of reasonable buff to the card to make it notably better would either have the effect of A, doing nothing, or B, making him well above what I would consider a healthy play threshold for Galactus. Because fundamentally, Marvel Snap is a game that is about winning 2 out of 3 locations. And Galactus takes that and says, no, actually, unless you interact with me specifically, it's about me. It's about me and only me, and I'm the only thing that matters. And whatever other cool things you were doing in the game, those are not good. And I think you can draw comparisons to, say, things like Living Tribunal, that like there are cards with similar dynamics in terms of centralizing the game around them and making it about interact with me or die. But none of them are as viscerally anti what Marvel Snap is about the way Galactus is. Like, I'm sure people in this comment section, in the viewership of this video, have played against Living Tribunal, done the math for how many points they're going to put out across all 3 locations, and said, I can still play normal Marvel Snap against this. I can win 2 out of 3 locations. Galactus very specifically breaking what Marvel Snap is about, I think, is just as much of a problem as the general difficulty with interacting with him. I am fairly sympathetic to the idea that we have more and better clog cards now, which by necessity sort of make Galactus a less powerful card. But I also think that Galactus sort of falls into this group of cards where I don't really think there's a lot of upside to making him better. I think it'll be fun for maybe a day and then not fun for the entire rest of the time that he's playable. Galactus is a very asymmetrically fun card. He is fun for the person who is doing the thing, and he is not fun for the person who is having the thing done to them. Or even when you're stopping Galactus, it's just like, oh, okay, I had the card that beats you. Cool, I love that. That's super engaging and awesome, right? That's sort of my issue with Galactus, is that I don't think there's a way to buff him to get to the play rate of being fringe playable without risking very heavily him being at a play rate that is unacceptably high. And because he's such a not fun card, because his fun is so asymmetric, I think I would prefer him in his current state. People focus way too much on decks with high win rate rather than cube rate. High cube rate decks, as a result, get given up on fast because people don't like losing a few games for the 1-game payout. I think there is like some reasonable truth to this, but I think that in practice, it tends to be better to focus on win rate, and I'll tell you why. Because when people actually talk about this, they don't mean it literally. What they mean is, I'm going on untap.gg, I'm going on snap.fan, I'm going on marvelsnap.pro, which is Snapzone's tracker, and I'm sorting by either cube rate or win rate, right? That's what people actually mean when they talk about this. And if you do that, sorting by cube rate, you will draw some very, very wrong conclusions, because cube rate to me is the stat that we have compared to win rate, compared to whatever, that is the most dependent on factors that are widely outside of your control. Win rate is a reasonable measure of base level power, right? How much does this deck win, right? It's a reasonable measure of base level power. There are confounding variables in there, like how many of this deck's wins are just like 2 cube retreats. Like Sandman, for example, is a deck that you can look at and say, okay, the win rate stats are really high, maybe cube rate mitigates that. And by the same token, there are decks for which cube rate is a valid argument for, like Mr. Negative is going to have a higher cube rate than relative to its win rate, Hela, or a Pixie deck. That all makes sense. But I think that the main determinant of having a high cube rate on one of those stat sites is, does your opponent know what you're doing? Because the biggest thing for winning a lot of cubes is your opponent being unfamiliar with your output range. The more unfamiliar your opponent is with your output range, the more able you are to juice a ton of cubes. The issue with that is that when you sort by cube rate, you get these decks that people are currently unfamiliar with, but the more popular they get, the more familiar with the play patterns people get, and then you start getting lower cube rates. For example, I ran into a deck that was attempting to play Dakin and then Supergiant and then MODOK and then Zola the Dakin, so they would arrive at 32 power Dakins. That's pretty cool, right? You have the Supergiant under MODOK, 32 power Dakins. It's a cool little combo. But I recognized it, and so instead of losing multiple cubes to that, I lost 1 cube to that because I figured out what they were doing. And that's a pretty obscure deck, right? Like, that's not a deck a lot of people know about, but I was still able to recognize it and mitigate the cube loss. And the kind of thing that sort of thing where, like, the value of playing an off-meta deck is very often in your opponent not knowing what you're doing and what the output range is, and that enabling you to get a lot more out of what you're playing than you otherwise would. I think if you just go to the stats websites and sort by cube rate, you're going to end up a little bit of a prisoner of the moment. You're going to be like, oh, this has a really high cube rate, and you really have to think how much of that is due to something like your opponents just not knowing what, like, your 1 or 2 hidden tech cards are. How much of that is going to be sustainable long term? And when I'm projecting outwards, I do think that win rate tends to be a more sustainable metric when I look at what is the long-term outcome here. People decry cards that are top tier on release, and also ones that are not very playable on release. They can't always strike the perfect balance, and thus exciting on release and fixed after is better. So people should stop scorning SD for Arishems and Lokis, they'll all pass. I think this is, like, sort of the big discussion about Marvel Snap right now, which is, how exactly do we want them to handle this stuff? Because a lot of the time, the thing I come to is that there's no real good ways to do it other than be perfect, right? So if we assume that they're not going to be able to be perfect, like, it's just not a thing, and they should lead into OTAs, would we rather they release cards too strong and then slowly nerf them down, or release cards too weak and then slowly nerf them up? To me, it seems very clear. I would prefer they release cards too strong and then slowly nerf them down. The problem is when they release cards that don't have the knobs to be slowly turned down. When they release a card that has to be fundamentally reworked, it is unable to be reasonably turned down in a manner that is acceptable to people. That's what I think the problem is. And to me, I think that means the goal of Marvel Snap's designers should be not achieving perfect balance, but making sure all the cards are balanceable. A great example of a non-balanceable card is Old Eliath. Released as a 6/5, ended up having the same text at 6/2 and was just as good because you couldn't actually change any of the numbers on that card and make it not do what it did. The numbers weren't really a part of why it was good. And so because of that, they have added a knob to it. Now, Eliath's power actually is a reasonable balance knob. They were able to be like, okay, let's put it at 6/8. Oh, it's not very good at 6/8. Let's make it 6/10. And then it's a better card. They need to make sure that every card they release, especially the weird ones, has those knobs on it. Arishem, I think, is a good example of a card that is weird and doesn't look like it has knobs, but actually does. If that card added 15 cards, if that card added 18 cards, like, they can do stuff with Arishem for sure. I think that, generally speaking, I would prefer if they release these cards with some sort of plan for what happens if this card is stronger than we expected, and what are our knobs on these cards sort of clearly delineated. That would be what I'd be looking for. Because I think people get far more, not necessarily more people get upset, but I think it's better for both the company and the player base if they stop making cards that are bad and then buffing them as they leave spotlight caches. I think that is such a feels bad moment that I would accept new cards being occasionally too strong and then tuned down in a few weeks a lot more than I would accept the repetition of multiple Hydra Bobs. I think that more often than not, they have leaned the way I'm talking about, where they've just been like, let's make sure, like, if we're going to release this card, let's make sure it hits, and making sure it hits does carry the risk of it hitting high. And sometimes they're wrong, but I think the fact that there's been a lot more release high and tone down than there have been Hydra Bobs does actually point towards this being a reasonable thing, a reasonable approach for them to take. I generally agree with this take. Content creators should not be allowed to post about a deck until they have a minimum 50 games. Posting stuff like this is ridiculous, despite the fact that I'm a huge fan of these guys. I get where you're coming from, but I think that's also a fallacy, right? 50 games is not a reasonable sample size in the hand of a content creator. Like, that's not the same thing. There's a million little tricks as a content creator that I see other content creators do and that I do sometimes. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them here. The first one is anytime you see anyone posting stats from before Infinite, that's bait. It's usually includes bots, just a ridiculous thing to do. The second one is Infinite Conquest stats, also bait. It's very, very biased by players who have the tracker. Anyone who is a content creator of Marvel Snap is in like the top 1% of people who play this game in terms of time. They're going to be better than the people they're playing in Infinite Conquest, who are very often players who are like CL 200 or whatever. It's like that sort of stuff. Those kind of tricks are like fairly common ones. Sample size, like, I get where you're coming from. They included some pictures of some content creators posting like, 15 or 10 game sample sizes and just like, wow, this deck is crazy. And I get being like, okay, that's ridiculous. But here's the thing. A 50 game sample size is also not enough to say that. Like, if you're looking for statistical significance, you're looking for like a real actual statistical proof of something, 50 game sample size is better, sure. But it's also not enough to guarantee that. It's just not. I am generally like, I am in favor of people being more critical. Here's a trick that I use. I hit top 5 on day 1. That's not all that amazing. Like, it's just a function of getting there pretty fast and having a good reset, right? I used it in my YouTube title. I've successfully baited your click. There you go. Get got, right? There's a lot of like tricks for things like that where I think that to some degree they're part of the game here being content creation, and to some degree I think they're misleading. I personally try very hard to, when I do clickbait or whatever it is like that, keep it factual and talk about what actually happened, right? Like, and provide as much context as I possibly can. Like, for that top 5 video, I also played that deck in Infinite and had like a 57% win rate over like, I think it was like 35 or 40 games. And it wasn't just like a deck that I used to beat up on bots. I also played it in Infinite. I probably wouldn't have made the video if I didn't, because if it was just a deck I used to beat up on bots, yeah, you know what I mean? So I have like some relatively strict ethical standards about stuff like this. I do think that this person's heart is in the right place, but I also just wanted to make it clear that I don't think a 50 game sample size would alleviate the issue here. The devs should stop, quote unquote, balancing cards so often, and should definitely stop touching the same card so often. It reeks of a lack of proper playtesting. I think this sort of fundamentally misunderstands a couple things. The first is, I don't care how much playtesting they have. I genuinely do not care. There is no possible way there is enough playtesting to replicate what it's like when a million people start putting in reps on something. You cannot do that. If they hired me to do playtesting, I can't imagine I'd be able to do that. Like, this is not something that I can look at from the outside and say, I know they can do this better, because personally, for my content, I rely so much on the aggregate numbers of other people and the specific other people at High Infinite that I talk to, and the numbers on Untapped and all of these other factors that I take in when I make one of my videos. I think about all of this stuff. It's a cohesive whole, and they have access to, on playtest, none of that. They have none of that. And so I don't really think it's fair to be like, hey, actually, we need you to perfectly predict how a metagame will develop when millions and millions of people start playing it. And if you get one thing wrong about that metagame, actually, it reeks of a lack of proper playtesting. I don't think that's fair. I think that actually the fact that they touch the game so much reduces the need for them to be perfectly predictive of the future. When you look at something like Magic, right? You have that card Nadu, which is just ruining things right now, which is very obviously the best thing to be doing in the format that it's in. And so they are unable to touch that card until their next announced banned and restricted list. And that is a problem, because that means it leaves players in the lurch. I think it's better that Marvel Snap is an iterative game. When they notice something is a problem, they change it. When they notice something is underperforming, they change it. And that it can be hard to deal with, hard to keep up with, but it is preferable to the alternative of just leaving that problem alone. They should prioritize casual players over competitive. Keep the flavor of the cards to the detriment of balance, i.e. Doc Ock and Blob. Half of this is a good point, I think. They should prioritize casual players over competitive. They should not make cards for me. They should make cards for the majority of players. Absolutely. The second part, though, where it implies that balance is not something a casual player cares about, I think that's wrong. I think casual players do care a lot about balance, because when you get cranked by a Doc Ock and lose, that feels bad. Like, the number one thing I think that people want out of card games is to win them, but failing that, they want to feel like they were in the game up until the point that they weren't. Dr. Octopus specifically is one of those cards where it's like, that card sucks. Like, if it's ever bad, if it's ever strong, it's really annoying. It just sucks. It's so awful. And I think you could make an argument that the flavor of this card is actually better now because, hey, guess what? He's a 4/8 now. He's got 4 arms. He's Dr. Octopus. Like, you could argue the flavor is better now with this new version. I do think that the blob thing, it's like, I didn't like that change to begin with. I didn't think it was enough to deal with what Arishem was actually doing. It felt like a week behind to me. I'd be happy if he got his ability back. I think that's basically totally fine. The main thing that I wanted to point out here, though, is the sort of crux of what this question is implying is that casual players don't care about balance. And I actually think, like, they might not have necessarily the tool or the skill set to express that they care about balance, but casual players really care about balance. Like, it's actually very important to them. And even if you think they don't care about balance in terms of like 54% win rate versus 55, they care about having fun. And Doc Ock is a thief of fun, for sure. So I think Doc Ock, at least, bad example here. Specifically the implication that balance is something that only matters to competitive players, disagree with that. The overall premise that like card game, the game itself should be focused on the casual player base, I actually do agree with. The community clamored for Second Dinner to improve the Pool 2/3 experience. Quietly, they did so dramatically. From spotlights raining cards on new players, to new player bundles, to extra resources from alliances, the Diner, and Conquest, it is so much better than it was for global launch players. I think that is true. I think there is this one thing that happens on my channel specifically, because my channel is geared toward, we'll say, like, based on the player psychographics, let's call them spikopaths, where they're very interested in winning as soon as they possibly can, right? There's still not a good avenue for that. And I think that when we talk about what we just talked about in the previous take, the game should be balanced for casual and not competitive, it kind of makes sense that there's not an avenue for that. They don't want you to be able to say, oh, well, I'm going to spend $200 on this deck, and then I'm going to have a PTQ level deck or whatever. They don't want that out of this game, and I think that is a restrictive decision, but it's one aimed at a very specific subset of players that are vastly overrepresented on my channel. And while I do think there are things that can be meaningfully done to improve the Pool 2, Pool 3 experience, I do think it's also important for people like me and people like the people on my channel to keep in mind that our perspective is probably not necessarily the common one. While both us and a casual player can complain about, getting cranked by whatever, right? Just getting obliterated by a card they don't have, there are differing solutions to that. For a casual player, the solution might be make it so I don't have to play against that. For a competitive player, the solution is make it so I have that. And I think that there are meaningful differences in approach and how they want to deal with that. And I think when people talk about Pool 2 and 3 issues, or the issues of being like a cheap, like someone who just started the game, they're valid, but I want to make sure that we sort of temper that by understanding that a lot of people who are talking about that stuff on my channel are people who are not reasonably described as casual anymore. And that is something to keep in mind, I think. I am not exactly positive as to how that impacts how I think about this. I do think that it's real that they have improved it. I don't think they have improved it to a point that I'm happy with it. But what I'm sort of realizing is I'm not sure if they ever can improve it to a point that I'm happy with it. I don't know if that's a thing that they can reasonably do. Reworking Chavez because it's not interesting deck building and releasing Arishem later on was stupid. She was present in the meta but not pressing, and she'd be totally fine today. Discard never really got a compensation for losing her and was the deck utilizing her the most. I think I disagree with all three of the premises here, so we're going to go through all three of them. Reworking Chavez because it's not interesting deck building and releasing Arishem later was stupid. These are opposite cards. Chavez is a card you put in your deck to reduce RNG, so that you are always drawing other cards first and more accurately accessing your game plan of choice. That is what her role was. She made decks 11 cards. Arishem makes decks 24 cards, increases RNG, and gives you a payoff for doing that. These are almost exactly opposite cards in terms of how they affect deck building, and Arishem is vastly more interesting for the game than Chavez was because of the randomness inherent in him. She was present in the meta, but not pressing, and she'd be totally fine today. Chavez was omnipresent in the meta. She was in almost every deck because why would you not play an 11-card deck when you could? She was pressing in the sense of, hey, if we're ever going to make other cards for these decks, for these archetypes, like Discard, for example, which I believe after the Chavez nerf got both Proxima Midnight and Corvus Glaive, so that's a little spoiler of what we're going to talk about in the third clause, how do we make cards that actually go in those decks when Chavez is probably better to put in those decks than those cards ever will be? The additional consistency that she provided to decks was only one part of the issue. The other part of the issue was making decks 11 cards makes it meaningfully harder for you to make a card that makes the cut in those 11 cards. And that is a real issue if you are a company whose income stream is based on making new cards. The third clause here is the discard never got compensated. As I understand it, they got both Proxima Midnight and Corvus Glaive afterwards, and for a time, discard was one of the two best decks in the game when that did actually happen without America Chavez, as I recall. So while I do think discard could use more help, I'm not going to argue against that. I don't think any of the premises stated in this thing are true. The power creep of Snap is hard to evaluate with all the recent OP 3-5s we've had recently, but I think we need a huge amount of buffs. Every time SD came out with smart buffs, it was absolute bangers. Venom, Magic, Claw, Viper, Ultron. We need more of this instead of nerfs mainly. I think that is sort of true. I agree they should do buffs. Like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, they shouldn't do buffs. But the one thing that really strikes me about this is the part where they are contrasted to nerfs. We need buffs instead of nerfs. I think that's like a really inexact science. When you have something that is a problem in the metagame, your solution should probably be, let's actually nerf it, rather than let's buff a card that's good into it. Let's buff other things up to that level, right? I don't think that's the right way to go about it because I don't think it's as easy to predict the outcome of a nerf or the outcome of a buff as it is to predict the outcome of a nerf. You can't sort of quantify power level. What does it mean to take a card and buff it up to the power level of Arishem? What does that actually mean? I think that's actually very hard to understand. But what it does mean for Arishem is let's tune Arishem down. Okay, 15 cards, 18 cards. Way easier to understand how to concretely balance something with a nerf than it is to arbitrarily drag other things up to the theoretical level of that thing, right? I personally do not think these things need to be contrasted. I think they should do buffs. I think they should also do nerfs. I do not think it's an instead of thing. I think the way they should do it is make sure they're increasing the power of some of the cards that kind of suck in this game by every time they do an OTA, and then just do that every single time. Like, make sure every OTA has something that's just like, I don't know, I'm buffing Typhoid Mary. Is it going to be super impactful? Probably not. But it shows that you give a crap. And I think showing that you give a crap has more value than you would think. Shang sucks the fun out of the game. I will be honest, I thought really hard about putting this take on here, not because it's a bad take, but because the user has Twitter Blue, and I feel like I don't know, pay me $8 instead, you know? The basic theory that I have here for why Shang-Chi does not suck the fun out of the game is that interaction is good. I think that the argument for Shang-Chi sucking the fun out of the game is that of the tech cards, he's probably the most punishing and the most commonly played. But we've had metagames with and without Shang-Chi. We've had metagames where the best decks are defined by Shang-Chi and not being vulnerable to him. On the whole, I would say Shang-Chi is far more of a good than he is a bad. I think a lot of the time people propose nerfs for Shang-Chi like he should be symmetrical. And I don't really think that's true, because when you look at like the decks that are playing Shang-Chi right now, there's really not a lot of like, oh my god, the symmetry is so bad. Like, that's really what's keeping it around. A lot of the Shang-Chi decks right now are Athena decks. They're not really going to hit anything where the symmetry would punish them ever. You maybe might be able to hit it in Arishem, but that seems like particularly not like a thing that would actually make me stop playing Shang-Chi and Arishem. I don't think that's a reasonable move. I think moving it up the curve also might not be a reasonable move. I don't know. I personally think Shang-Chi does a lot of good things for the game, because it allows them to sort of push the envelope in design and know that if they make something that's like too stupid, too big, Shang-Chi will be able to clean it up in a real way. I think Shang-Chi is not necessarily the card I would have chosen if I had to pick one card to be like one of the most played cards in the game. But the fact that he is not indicative of a problem. It is indicative of him solving a problem. Going to have to address temp energy gain / max energy gain with a release valve before it becomes the dominant strategy / issue, which it's close to being, i.e. Hope, Arishem, Wiccan, Electro. Okay, so two of these things are not like the other. Like, Hope, Arishem, amazing. Wiccan, Electro, not so much. That's just my read. Maybe I'm wrong about Wiccan, we'll see. But I think people are doing this thing that I've seen happen with cost reduction before, where they're like, oh, there are some really good cost reduction cards, therefore cost reduction is always broken. And I think they're looking at Arishem and Hope, and they're like, therefore energy gain is always broken. It's not. It's about the numbers. It's the numbers. It's the numbers in the context. The numbers in the context are what make those cards broken. Hope is broken, or very, very good, because there is a whole package revolving around Kitty Pryde and Thena and Angela and sometimes Elsa and move cards like Jeff and Nocturne. Without that stuff, Hope is not what she is. Arishem is considerably stronger than the other options because you aren't paying a cost in terms of I have to actually play this card in order to get the benefit. You are getting the benefit for a deck building cost, but not an actual gameplay cost, and that is why Arishem is stronger. Electro sucks, and Wiccan, I think, probably won't be very good, and because they are not filling the same contextual roles as the first two. I think what this actually demonstrates is it's very easy to balance that stuff, because some of them are balanced and some of them aren't, right? It's not an issue of the fundamentals here. This isn't like a fundamentally broken mechanic. It's about the context in which the energy is used. We exist in the context of all in which we live and what came before us, and it's important to keep that in mind. There should be a more strict schedule for when cards show up again in spotlight caches. Waiting 3 or more months sucks if you miss a card on release week. I think what's holding them back is commissioning artists to produce more variants. I think that this would be a good thing. That's actually my whole take on that. I think that one of the main pain points in Marvel Snap right now is how much it sucks when you miss a card. I would love if they did anything to alleviate that, basically. Thank you to CheeseButt69 for the one take that I agreed with the most. As always, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sitting through another episode of Marvel Yap, aka Snap and A Smith, aka Snap Bayless, aka The Hot Takes Show. I've been KM Best. Let me know what you thought about this episode if you have takes. Remember, I post these on Twitter, and those are the only place that I can actually take submissions from, because if I took submissions from YouTube comments and my Discord, I would be inundated with this stuff very, very frequently. So please do remember that. Thank you so much for watching. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.